westward we go, toward the last buffalo, to the high plains of sturdy short.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stuart Schrag. I'm the Assistant Secretary with Kansas Wildlife and Parks. Josh, if you need to shut me down, because I'm going to give a little history in Kansas. When Josh asked me to come help with this as a state agency, we don't have any current herds within the Flint Hills. Not that I don't have aspirations to see that happen in the future. But just a historical perspective of state herds in the state. I'm going to start back in 1919 for you history buffs in the room. Back in 1919, a guy named Charles Goodnight, which I'm sure many of you know, sold 9 head of bison in southwest Kansas in the Oklahoma Panhandle area to a gentleman named Frank Goodnight. No relation from what I can tell. After that transaction, in 1924, Kansas Forestry Fish and Game Commission took a stance in the early 20s that we wanted to be part of the national, conservation movement to keep these, mammals, restore them and keep them thriving and build the herds across the nation. So in 1924, our agency got 2 cows and a bull from the Wichita Mountains Refuge in Oklahoma. So that started our herd as a state agency down there at the Finney Game Refuge in Garden City. Then sometime between 1919 and 1925, Frank Goodnight sold 9 of his head to a guy named Frank Maple out of Beaver City, Oklahoma. Well, during the 1919 to 1925 era, our agency bought another 10 head from Frank Maple. So we like to lay claim that our herds actually were descendants of Charles Goodnight's. Part of this collaboration with Frank Maple and Frank Goodnight were the animals that we bought from Frank Maple stayed on the Briggs Ranch near the same area in southwest Kansas. The Briggs Ranch was kind of known for rodeo stock contracting as well. And we don't have the historical records to know, but we believe that our animals were kept separate from the Briggs bison because Briggs were using their bison for rodeos as well in the Sun City area. But anyway, we believe our descendant herds, our original base herds, were from Charles Goodnight. So a little bit of history there. Fast forward, from the 1925 area through 1939, we kept a lot of our bison on the Briggs Ranch. We'd bring them into Garden City, the Finney Game Refuge at the time, when we had new fence built and we were expanding the refuge down there. So that really started that herd. We bring in more animals from the Wichita Mountains. And fast forward then to 1951, the early 50s, the Maxwell brothers in McPherson County donated all that land there that's now known as Maxwell Wildlife Refuge. And I've been intimately involved with that herd for the last 30 years. I'm a third generation on my place, rancher down in southern Reno County on the Kingman County line. Always raised beef cattle, but I've just recently switched over and dabbling now in the bison hobby business. My pasture has 9 historic wallows in it. So I tried to come up with a good name, and now I have 9 Wallow Bison Company. So anyway, that's my personal history with this. As a state agency, we ended up with the Maxwell herd in 1951. We brought in, I believe, 7 cows and 3 bulls from the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma, and that started that herd. Now we average 175 animals after auction, and we just had our annual auction in November. It's in the 70s and 80s, and even before that, before bison were so readily available nationwide, people would use Maxwell as kind of a hub herd to come to our auction and start their own herds. And there was actually kind of a circuit of auctions that people would target throughout the country, and Maxwell was kind of the center hub. Whether they hit Wichita Mountains, Maxwell, they'd go up to Custer, Niobrara, Wind Cave, a lot of those national herds where they had held auctions. So we were a starter herd for a lot of people and still are. and we like to hang our hat on that. But we are more of a conservation based. Like TNC, we dabble on we flip flop back and forth between conservation versus production. All the money that we raise from the annual auction goes right back into the refuge, and we also bring in sand sage, former Finney Game Refuge, sand sage bison range animals, and sell them in our auction too. We've had to destock at sand sage somewhat the last few years because of the exceptional drought. We brought some of those animals up to Maxwell. It's rained a lot more down there this year than it has in other places, so we're hoping to take some animals back there. But for a long time, we had kind of satellite herds as a state agency too. We had one at Meade, down at Kingman State Lake. We had a herd. Crawford State Lake, we had a herd. We still have the Bob Grant Memorial Bison herd down there at Frontenac. So I have grand visions of expanding. As a state agency who's about conservation and managing habitat, we do utilize domestic cattle to manage habitat on a lot of our public properties. And if we can, I'd like to use native grazers, i.e. bison, to do that. We have some hurdles and some obstacles to get through to make that happen. But I want to also mention too that I recently, in the last couple of years, have been on the board of directors for the National Bison Association. Some national issues that are kind of at the forefront. I don't know if anybody have heard the truth in labeling issues that have been going on. That has to do with mainly pet food and water buffalo being used in the pet food, but they call it buffalo. And so we've taken it to Congress to get a Truth in Labeling Act pushed through, and it's gotten a lot of support. And what that means is if you're going to make pet food out of water buffalo, you're going to clearly define that on the label of the packaging, so it doesn't conflict with the true bison industry. So a shameless pitch for what we got coming up, June of 2024, which, if you remember my historical timeline, 1924 is when the agency started our first herd. 2024 will be our 100-year anniversary as a state agency conserving and managing bison. So to go along with that, at Maxwell, June 7th and 8th, the National Bison Association, Wildlife and Parks, and the Kansas Buffalo Association will be hosting a summer conference at Maxwell. So if any KBA, NBA members in here, any wannabe NBA members, please take a look at that online. And we're expecting a good crowd and a good turnout for that. It'll be good informational time talking about some bison disease issues. So that's my shameless pitch, and I'm glad to be here.
Stuart, one thing before you go, Mike, the herd at Jacob's Well out there in the basin, is that a state herd too, or is that?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I appreciate that. So Big Basin Preserve is another one. We own that property. It's about 1,800 acres, but Dick Gehring and Reese Gehring, Thunder of the Plains and Black Kettle, we actually have a contract for their animals to graze on that property, and we've had that contract for a while. Not sure where that's going. We've actually talked about, if Dick and Reese or whoever doesn't want to actually bring in their own private animals, that us as an agency could utilize that property as a replacement herd, meaning we could bring in TNC animals or Niobrara animals or Custer animals and have that herd there, and then we could use those animals to be replacement stock at Maxwell and Sand Sage and anywhere else that we might develop herds in the future. So yeah, that is another one of our big herds. It's a very popular attraction. So.
On westward we go toward the last buffalo, to the high plains of sturdy short grass, where the great southern herd still a sight beyond words, as it covers the prairie so vast. On to Plum Creek and Turkey Creek